All right, so Russia's early history. Settlers and conquerors from Europe and Asia shaped you know, the early history of Russia and the Eurasian republics. So we were looking at the map of Europe and we looked at places like Norway, Sweden, Finland. These areas were inhabited a long, long time ago by people we call the Vikings. Um, these people, used to sail in. The Vikings were kind of a warrior type, people who would sail in, conquer a place, but then they would leave. Basically, they would ask these areas to, give them tribute or some kind of money to keep them from coming there and invading. Um, the culture of the Slavic people, had the most lasting influence on early Russia. The Vikings, sometimes called Rus or Ruses, came from Scandinavia and took control of towns such as Novgorod and Kiev. In the 1200s, Genghis Khan established the Mongol Empire in Central Asia. His descendants took over much of Russia and cut off Europe, uh, was cut off from Europe, but connected east to East Asia by the Silk Road. So if you look at this right here, the map, you see the Silk Road starts in China and stretches all the way out towards the Mediterranean Sea. You have the Gobi Desert here up towards the north, and Russia is found over in this area. You see the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea right there. Later, Russian princes successfully fought against Mongol rule and established a capital at Moscow. Moscow is the capital today. So if you look right here at this is an interesting map. St. Petersburg, Moscow is right here. The Ural Mountains separate, European Russia from Asian Russia over here, the Aral Sea and Caspian Sea located there. China's down here, and Mongolia is located right here. Ivan the Great was the Grand Prince of Russia from 1462 to 1505. And, you know, he overthrew the Mongols and eventually set up the capital in Moscow. From serfdom to industrialization to revolution, for centuries, most Russian workers were peasants called serfs who worked the land of wealthy landlords. Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861. The Industrial Revolution began in Russia around 1890. During this time, during industrialization, there was a group of communist people led by Vladimir Lenin, who began the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the goal was to take over industry and, have government control all the means of production, all the industry. And the belief was by doing this, they would, equal out, how everyone basically was paid. So if you were a communist, and these are communist revolution, the belief is that if the government controls, your means of industry, and controls sort of the communal farms and things like that, then they could take those resources and those things, build stuff, and then pay everyone an equal wage or the same wage. Everyone makes the same amount of money. Everyone makes the same, sort of, I guess what you would say, uh, living. And, you know, the Russian Revolution in 1917, Lenin is a very, popular person. They used the book written by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, the Communist Manifesto, to sort of take over, and the czar was overthrown. The person who was the leader at the time, the czar, the royal family, was overthrown, and Lenin became the leader of a new communist government. And in this, you had, during this revolution, you had industry fall into the hands of the government, and most of the products and things they made were based on the needs of the government. So um, their industrial revolution a whole lot different from ours. In a capitalist society, you had wealthy sort of owners of industry who, for example, like Henry Ford. Henry Ford, built cars, the assembly line, all that stuff you learned in U.S. history, and he profited greatly from it. Became extremely rich. In this sort of society, the government, they're the ones that owns the means of production. They own the plants. They own all of the things that are being built there. So there's no one getting rich. The government itself um, sort of controls everything, and um, private people don't own industry.
The Russian Revolution. The year is 1914. World War I had begun, and Russia was at war with Germany. The working class and the peasants make up the Russian army. However, they are not well equipped or trained for the battles to come. The year is now 1917. Millions of Russians had been either killed or wounded. The Russian people were angry at Tsar Nicholas II for getting Russia into the war, and several other reasons, including the Tsar taking personal command of the army, Rasputin's power over the royal family, food shortages, and growing political opposition. The first revolution came about in February 1917 on the Julian calendar in Petrograd, which was the capital of Imperial Russia. Demonstrators protested about the lack of bread due to rationing and were soon joined by striking workers. The army was called upon to suppress the uprising. Several protesters were shot and killed by the soldiers. However, many refused to open fire. The army, too, it seemed, had mutinied against the Tsar. The Petrograd Soviet was the city council for workers and soldiers. Now, more and more workers and soldiers elected people to it in order to represent their demands. The Tsar abdicated, bringing an end to the Tsarist autocracy, and a new government took over. This government was run by two political parties, the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. The Bolshevik Revolution. The Provisional Government was also unpopular. It made the decision to remain in the war and failed to give land to the peasants. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks were a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He had a simple slogan which would appeal to the people and the Petrograd Soviet: peace, bread, and land. Peace, the end of Russia's involvement in World War I. Bread, solving food shortages, and land, which would go to the peasants. He also stated all power to the Soviets, meaning that he would seize power in the name of the Soviet. On November 6 and 7, 1917, or October 24 and 25 on the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, launched a coup d'etat against the provisional government. They stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the provisional government, putting themselves in charge of Russia's government. After the revolution, the Bolshevik government exited the war by signing a peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. A civil war would erupt in 1918 by those who were against the new Bolshevik government, the White Army, and the Bolsheviks themselves, the Red Army. Subscribe to see more history videos. Get Simple History, the Russian Revolution, and Simple History.
All right, and so what was formed after this was called the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks believed in a communist form of government and a socialist economic system. They felt this was the answer to the problems of the Industrial Revolution, where you had, extremely rich and wealthy people who owned the means of production or owned the factories and stuff like that, They wanted a classless society where they believed everyone would be equal. Soviet Union was formed in 1922. Originally, Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, but mostly was controlled by Russia. When Lenin died, Joseph Stalin came to power. Stalin means man of steel. He had total command of the Soviet people from 1927 to 1953. And during this time period, the Soviet citizens were, extremely isolated from the West. Um, they called this time period the Iron Curtain because a lot of people didn't know what was going on in Russia. Stalin also instituted what's called the Great Purge, in which he killed at least 10 million of his, opponents during this time period. Um, Russian citizens and people like that were very isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. They could not leave. They could not, they had to stay in Russia. They couldn't travel to Western countries that had, democratic governments and things like that.